probably is not a watch you're gonna buy. It's not a watch I'm gonna buy. This isn't even a watch that's still produced. This was discontinued a few years ago. But I think it's interesting, and that's what this channel is for. It's not for watch news or industry hot takes, but for watches that I think are cool, that, and making fun of the hobby, and this watch kind of covers both of those important topics. I've been wanting to make a video about this Offshore forged carbon ever since I knew that my buddy John had it. John recently went on a cruise and he left this watch with me, and while I wish him a safe journey, don't hurry back, John. Me and this Royal Oak, we've made a connection, and I think it prefers my wrist to yours. I know that might be hard to hear. The Royal Oak Offshore collection is so weird to me, and I can't imagine how bizarre it must have seemed in 1993 when the first Offshore launched. The first Royal Oak Offshore was the chronograph 25721ST. It was also known as the Beast, and maybe you can understand why. Compared to the previous Royal Oaks, it was huge and heavy and came on a massively thick bracelet. But it sold, and the Offshore line became a super successful collection for Audemars Piguet, a much faster success than the original Royal Oak in 1972. And for years, the only Royal Oak Offshore watches were chronographs for many years. It wasn't until 2010 that AP launched the Offshore Diver. That reference was the 15703 and looked nearly identical to this 15710, which I briefly owned. That's right, I owned this Offshore Diver. I bought a new steel Offshore Diver in 2019 and I sold it about 5 days later. No kidding, 5 days, maybe 4 days. I tried on a lot of Offshores in stores and I loved them. I loved all of them, so fun and weird and bold. But the problem with trying on a watch in a store is that you don't really get the full experience. You don't really get to feel how they wear. The steel 15710 was painfully uncomfortable on my 7-inch wrist. Truly painful. The case was way too heavy, the strap was too stiff, it didn't fit right, it didn't feel right. And for some watches, for cheaper watches, I can put up with that, but for $20,000, I was not okay with that. So after a couple of days, it went back in the box and it sold quickly. I don't miss that steel watch, but I've always liked how the Offshore Diver looked. So when I saw this carbon watch, I thought maybe the reduced weight, maybe that's exactly the Offshore for me. This forged carbon Offshore Diver came out in 2012. I don't know when Audemars Piguet stopped making it, but it's been several years. It originally listed for about $24,000. Today, used, I've seen them from $25,000 to $35,000. It's a really small sample size, so it's kind of hard to say how much it's worth. It has all the same dimensions as other Offshore Divers. It's technically 42 millimeters across and 14 millimeters thick. It's water resistant to 300 meters and is in line with the ISO dive watch specs. For example, a unidirectional timing bezel, but this one is on the inside of the watch, unlike with most dive watches, which probably means that you cannot adjust this underwater. And this gets to the silliness of a watch like this. Nominally, yeah, this is a dive watch, and nominally the original Royal Oak is a sports watch, but a $30,000 watch that you can't really time your dives with, and which has a strap that probably costs more than the rest of your dive gear combined. This is not a tool watch. The Omega Speedmaster is not a tool watch. The Rolex Submariner, not a tool watch. Stop saying things like that. A G-Shock, maybe. A Garmin, probably. But I do think there's a kind of self-awareness with a watch like this, at least from AP and hopefully from owners of Offshores. I think, or at least I hope, that nobody is under the illusion that this is a watch for diving professionals. And if you are under that impression, cut it out, you. If you like a mechanical watch, especially an expensive one, hopefully it's simply because you like it as a piece of jewelry, because that's what this is. That's what nearly all mechanical watches are, fashion accessories. And when I evaluate the Offshore with that understanding, I still really, really like the Offshore Diver. And this forged carbon reference does address at least one issue I had with the steel reference that I owned. That's the comfort. This watch weighs about 111 grams. The one I owned weighs about 170 grams. That means that the steel is about 53% heavier, and that makes a huge difference on my impeccably sized and perfectly proportioned 7-inch wrist. This watch is not only lighter but more balanced on the wrist. It doesn't flop around like the steel one did for me. The main case of this watch is made of forged carbon. What that means is that it's a fancy plastic or resin with carbon fibers kind of reinforcing the fancy plastic. And the forged part of that is that AP formed the case in a mold. This watch is at least 10 years old and has been worn a lot, but the edges still look really crisp, and the surfaces don't look scratched, dented, or gouged, which is more than I can say for myself over the last 10 years. And the bezel is made of ceramic, super scratch resistant, but could be cracked with a hard enough knock. The scratch resistance of this bezel is also a win for me over the steel Offshore. With its weight and 14mm thickness, I would have destroyed that steel bezel within weeks, but this carbon does it right, for me. Now I still think this wears really big. On paper it's 42mm wide. That doesn't seem too big. I have watches larger than that. I wear a Panerai PAM 111 that's 44mm across, and I wear an Omega Ploprof that's 9000mm across. But the difference with the Offshore, I think, is the strap. The rubber strap starts at 28mm and tapers to 24mm wide. That gives this watch the feeling of wearing a very wide cuff, no matter how light the watch is. The whole combo it has a lot of surface area. Compare that to this Tudor Pelagos. This is also 42mm across. From the top down, these watches are kinda the same, but from a different angle, very, very different. And it doesn't help that the strap of the Offshore really flares out from the case. My wrist is an above average size just like my ego, but I wish the strap could drop straight down from the case a little more. I would say that a 42mm Royal Oak Offshore wears like a 44mm watch, and the 44mm Offshores, those wear like, I don't even know how to say, they're huge. They're huge. Inside this Offshore diver is the AP Caliber 3120. It's a fully in-house movement that I wish was visible in this watch. The newer Offshore divers have a display back, and it's a good-looking movement. Here you're looking at the 3120 through the back of the steel diver. It's cool to have a fully in-house high horology movement, but functionally, I can't tell the difference between the AP 3120 and a well-adjusted Sellita. It has 60 hours of power reserve. That's not that exciting. It beats at 3 Hz, also not interesting. Someone give me a good reason to be impressed with this movement besides the fact that it's expensive. And that's kind of a thing I wonder about with this watch at all, like would I like it if it wasn't expensive? There are carbon and ceramic watches that sell for just above $1,000, and they're just as functional as this Royal Oak and maybe even easier to wear, and I wouldn't call the finishing on this anything special. So I wonder, when people blow up my Instagram comments about this watch, is it because they like the watch or is it because they like the rarity and the prestige? I don't know because I'm kind of unable to answer that question about myself. I can't seem to separate the design and engineering from the price and the hype. And maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it doesn't matter why I like a watch, just that I do like it a lot. Not $30,000 worth, but enough to make a video about it, and enough to hope that John extends his vacation by a couple weeks or a few months.